There are 10,000 ways to die in the 41st millennium, but only one way to truly suffer, to fall into the hands of the Dark Eldar. I remember waking in the dark, my body bound, my mouth dry, my ears filled with the scrape of chains against iron floors. The air was hot, sour with sweat and fear, and something more acrid, the scent of blood. My last memory of freedom was the green flare of a sky splitting open above my world, and the shapes that poured through like shadows with knives. Now I lay crammed in a cell of jagged metal, bodies pressed against me, their moans and prayers snatched by the blackness. I tried to move. The chain at my neck snapped me down to the deck. My hands were free enough to feel the grooves of scars cut into the metal by countless slaves before me. Their fingernails had broken here. Their blood had dried here. Then came the sound. The guttural growl of engines that were not of the Imperium. A pulse, like a heartbeat magnified, filling the hull. Somewhere above, screams echoed, not in defiance, but as playthings, laughter following them like a cruel chorus. I understood then. This was not simply transport. It was spectacle. Our pain was music to them. The others in the cell whispered fragments of prayer. One, a guardsman by the tatters of his uniform, whispered the Emperor's name until a blade slid through the bars and silenced him forever. No warning. No reason. Just amusement. I tried to keep silent. To breathe shallowly. To make myself smaller. But silence was no shield here. A voice, high and mocking, cut through the clamor. Wake, cattle. Comora awaits you. And with that, the darkness grew teeth. Comora. The name meant nothing when it was first spat at us, but I would soon learn that it was not merely a city, it was a hunger given form. The raider ship lurched, gravity shifting unnaturally as if reality itself bent under unseen claws. My stomach twisted. The warp had not taken us, but something far worse. Through the cracks in the rusted wall of our pen, I saw a tear of light open like a wound, and beyond it, black spires that clawed higher than sight, bridges webbing between them like the threads of some monstrous arachnid. It was endless. It was alive. Comora, the dark city. The air thickened with screams as we were herded down ramps onto obsidian streets that bled shadows. Chains jerked us into columns, the crack of electro-whips ensuring obedience. Above, the sky swam with hovering craft shaped like talons and blades. Their silhouettes flickered against lightless suns, while the laughter of unseen watchers echoed from balconies. I had thought my hive world was vast, oppressive, inescapable. But Comora dwarfed it 1,000-fold. Its towers were carved not by human hands but by cruelty itself. Walls were etched with screaming faces trapped forever in the stone. Walkways glittered with fluids I dared not name. A Kabbalite warrior stalked past, his armor a midnight sheen traced with cruel sigils. He paused, studying us the way one might inspect livestock. His helm shifted toward me, and though I could not see his eyes, I felt the weight of his attention like a blade pressing into my throat. Then, just as quickly, he turned away, disinterested. That was worse than death. Some of the slaves wept openly. Others muttered prayers that went unanswered. The air smelled of ozone and despair. As we marched deeper, I realized something chilling. The screams never stopped. They rose and fell like the tide, sometimes close, sometimes far, but never gone. Comora was a city of eternal agony. And I had just become a part of it. The first thing I learned in Comora was that flesh had value, but only in the way a knife values the meat it cuts. We were herded into a cavernous hall lit by flares of violet fire. The air was thick with incense that burned the lungs and masked the reek of blood. A dais stood at the far end, draped in silks that glimmered like oil on water. There, an auctioneer in armor of bone and jade spread his arms wide, his voice amplified by arcane vox crystals that made each word pierce my skull. The markets of flesh had begun. Slaves were dragged forward one by one. Chains rattled, whips cracked, and each trembling body was forced to stand beneath the auctioneer's hand as he described their strengths and flaws to the crowd. The audience, Drukhari nobles, masked and draped in finery stitched from agony, leaned forward in cruel fascination. A muscle-bound pit-fighter was sold to the cult of strife, her fate surely to bleed in the arenas. A child was taken by a homunculus, who caressed her cheek with fingers tipped in syringes before claiming her. When my turn came, I could not meet their eyes. The light burned down, exposing every scar, every tremor of fear in me. Laughter rippled through the chamber, sharp and cold as glass. The auctioneer's words crawled through my ears. Strong back. Human stock. Broken spirit, but not beyond use. A bid was made, high and swift. The figure who claimed me did not speak, only raised a hand clad in a gauntlet that shimmered with living runes. My chain was yanked, and I was pulled into the shadows at his side. Around me, others screamed as they were dragged toward their buyers. I caught one last glimpse of the guardsman who had whispered the Emperor's name. He was bought by a wich, her grin a promise of torment beyond imagining. There were no friends here. Only commodities, scattered like coins into the endless hunger of Commorragh. The brand came before the name. Dragged into a chamber of cold stone and harsher light, I was forced to my knees. The Drukhari who had purchased me stood above, his armor lacquered black with a sheen like poison glass. A helm hid his face, but his voice was a hiss, drawn out like a serpent savoring its prey. You are mine now. Remember that, cattle. Slaves knelt and rose, each claimed by a different master. An attendant, little more than a husk of a being, stripped of will, brought forth a brazier filled with searing coals. Within it, iron sigils glowed. The marks of ownership. When they pressed it to my flesh, the pain was more than fire. The rune flared with alien energy that gnawed deeper than skin, etching itself into the soul. I bit down until blood filled my mouth, but the scream still tore out of me. The chamber echoed with the chorus of the branded, a symphony of agony that made the Drukhari laugh. The mark burned across my shoulder, twisting my flesh into the sigil of a cabal. I did not know its name then, only that I was now a belonging, a tool in the arsenal of a lord who saw me as no more than a trinket. Tasks followed swiftly. I was set to carry, clean, and kneel at a word. Every mistake brought punishment, not death, but precision pain, crafted to remind me that hope was weakness. They wanted fear. They wanted submission. But above all, they wanted me alive, because a living slave suffers longer. In rare moments of stillness, I traced the edges of the brand with trembling fingers. It never cooled. It pulsed faintly, as though a tether tied me to my master's will. I was no longer a person. I was property. And that was only the beginning. They called it the arena, but the name was polite, a salon for carnage, a cathedral built to applaud the clean, practiced cruelty of Drukhari appetites. They dragged me there at dusk, though dusk in Commorragh meant nothing more than a shift in the pattern of lights and torches. The corridor into the amphitheatre smelled of iron and sweet oils, the walls carved with reliefs of contorted faces frozen in ecstatic torment. Above us ran a walkway where noble feet and jeweled heels passed in a slow, predatory procession. From below, the thud of boots and the cheer of onlookers rose like a storm. The brand at my shoulder burned as if embarrassed to be hidden beneath the coarse cloth they forced on me. The entrance opened onto a bowl hewn from basalt and bone. Flares of violet fire leapt from braziers, throwing monstrous shadows that crawled up the tiers. The crowd was a living thing, masked, painted, guzzling scents and spectacles like a starving thing greedily devours meat. The wights were already there, sleek, lethal, bodies a choreography of scars and tattoos, muscles honed and honed again until pain itself was a tool in their hands. Their armor was minimal by design. Every new bruise, every stitchwork scar, was a novelty the audience paid for. They moved with the sinuous, practiced grace of predators who had honed killing into art. They made us stand before the pit. The pit was a sunless maw, ringed in metal spikes and lined with the remnants of prior contests. Scales, bone, the oddly preserved flesh returned from some surgical theatre. I watched a wich step into the sand and listened as she loosened the cords of her hair with one practiced flick, then smile. It was a smile that promised pain in place of mercy. When the first match began, competence declared itself with elegant brutality. A brute of an orc, drugged and bedazzled in trophies, charged like a freight engine. The wich did not waste motion. She sidestepped as if the charge were a mere suggestion, her footwork a series of precise arcs that put the orc's mass against its own momentum. With a sudden, beautifully cruel twist she stabbed upward, not to kill outright, but to open and to choreograph. The orc flailed, blinded by pain and surprise, and the crowd roared, rewarding the wich's professional cruelty with a cascade of applause. The arena sang with that approval, a currency as valuable as anything in Commorragh. I was not bought to fight, yet proximity breeds imitation. Watching, I learned the rhythm of survival, step, feint, exploit. A pit fighter next to me, purchased earlier, moved with the efficiency of someone trained in the mathematics of violence. She showed me, between bouts, where to place my feet to avoid slipping on the slick blood-damp sand, how to hold my hands to prevent a guard's hook from finding my throat. She whistled a small, humorless tune and said, "You live by the movements you keep when the knives fly." That was competence, survival as craftsmanship. The soldiers and performers around me honed until instinct was instrument, until cruelty looked like beauty. Even the tech on display had an artistry to it. Splinter pistols flashed like malevolent constellations from balcony to pit, each projectile a barbed needle meant to gnaw living tissue. Chains coated in drugs and toxins were used to augment spectacle. Victims convulsed in ways the Drukhari deemed amusing and, if they were skilled, instructive for the crowd. A harlequin-like flash of discipline, they not harlequins, I only mean the same impossibly swift reflexes, came from a painted WICH who used an electrorod not to burn but to choreograph, a short, controlled current that made an opponent jerk into a trap, giving a partner a clean opening. The instruments of torture were also instruments of performance. There were quieter horrors than the matches. Between rounds, masters paraded their purchases like ornaments, judging the quality of scars, the pliancy of muscle, whether an eye glinted with enough fear to be entertaining for a season. A homunculus passed on the walkway, his tools clinking in a bag at his hip. He stopped and leaned over the railing, peering at the gathered captives with the curiosity of a surgeon who is also an artist. He marked one with a tiny, quick prod that made the slave faint from pain and then laugh at his own weakness when he came to. The homunculus's competence was in the precision of his cruelty. He did not waste flesh. He preserved certain traits, grafted others, and catalogued the results for patrons who wanted bespoke pain. I learned that even this theatre was a ledger. Contracts were whispered in the shadows, this slave into the wives, that one to the Cabalite lord who favoured slow, elaborate dismemberments for his private table. The price paid for a captive was not just their strength but their novelty. A brand, a scar pattern, a reaction to a particular toxin. These could make a life of servitude more or less profitable. The market and the arena were two faces of the same coin. One crafted desire, the other consumed it. Yet beneath the spectacle, a stronger fear took root in me, the sense that even in this place of performance, escape was less an act than a story the Drukhari kept telling themselves to entertain their gods. The wights moved like a storm that always ends where it began. The pit consumed and returned in cycles. Every cheer tempered the memory of chains. Every moment of admired skill underscored the gulf between predator and prey. I found small things to cling to, a rhythm tapped under breath, a memory of a childhood song hummed in a voice hoarse with disuse. The pit taught me patience as surely as it taught me fear. I learned to watch not only the weapons but the patterns of eyes in the crowd. I learned that a noble's hand twitched before they bid, that an experienced WICH would flash a blade a certain way before closing for the kill. Knowledge mattered. Competence mattered more. Even as I was taught to avoid the obvious cuts and to survive the spectacle, I watched a plan form in the minds of three other captives, a pit fighter, a thief from some Eldar fringe, and a woman with hands that moved like prayer. They exchanged glances like knives sharpening. Still with me in this black heart? Tap like if the dread grips you. We left the arena not as we entered. Some were reduced to empty shells, faces smooth as porcelain with shock, others bore new marks of favour, scars that promised more profitable servitude. I bore the same brand, but I carried now a faint memory of professional efficiency, the WICH's footwork, the pit fighter's angle, the thief's quick fingers. Little things, perhaps, but in Comorragh such small advantages could tilt a life. And as the doors closed behind us, drowning the cheering, another thought slithered in with the air. In a city that treated pain like currency, competence could make you valuable, and therefore, worthy of worse things. Blood was their currency, and we were the coins they spent until nothing remained. Life under a Cabalite master was a rhythm of cruelty, each day punctuated by violence as predictably as the toll of a hive bell. I rose when my chain was tugged, carried when ordered, bled when commanded. The tasks were menial, hauling amphorae filled with fluids best left unnamed, polishing the serrated edges of alien weapons, scrubbing stone floors slick with gore. Yet every moment was drenched in fear, because failure was punished not by death, but by artistry. One morning, though mourning in Comorragh was a meaningless word, my master had us line up in the shadow of his throne. He spoke little, preferring instead to let his cruelty play through gestures. A slave who stumbled under a burden was not beaten. Instead, the Lord flicked a rune on his gauntlet. The slave's brand flared like molten iron, and the man convulsed, his own nerves weaponized against him. The others in line watched in silence, knowing the lesson. Pain could be summoned at will. Still, even in chains, we found slivers of competence, ways to endure, to make ourselves useful enough not to be discarded. I learned how to carry amphorae with balance, so they never tipped. I learned to anticipate the lash of a whip by the subtle shift in a guard stance. Another slave, once a medici orderly, whispered to me how to tighten rags to slow bleeding, how to keep a wound from festering in this nightmare city. We passed such knowledge like contraband, small tools of survival that gave us something resembling control. Yet the Drukhari noticed. They always noticed. My master watched me one evening as I scrubbed a blood-slick floor until it gleamed like polished obsidian. His laughter rang out sharp as blades. Even cattle learn tricks. Perhaps we'll see how many tricks you have before you break. The brand on my shoulder pulsed hot. I realized then, my competence was not a shield. It was bait. Hope in Comora is not a flame. It is a spark buried deep in ash, dangerous the moment it shows itself. It began with whispers in the slave pens, when the guard's laughter faded into the distance. A pit fighter, her arms still scarred from the arena, leaned close and muttered, "There are ways out. Not safe. Not certain. But ways." Her voice was a rasp, the sound of someone who had swallowed too much blood. I thought her mad. Escape in a city where even shadows had teeth. Yet others listened. A thief from a pleasure world, quick-eyed and quicker with her hands, traced shapes in the grime that suggested routes, sewers, labyrinthine back passages, service tunnels used by the homunculi's apprentices. Each mark was wiped clean before dawn, but the memory of her sketches clung to us. At night, when chains allowed us to shift slightly on the cold stone, we spoke in fragments. We shared names, or what was left of them. We told stories of lives stolen. One man described the sun on fields of wheat, though his voice cracked as if the memory itself were painful. Another swore he had once seen a space marine, and clung to that vision as proof that salvation could exist. These whispers became dangerous. The Drukhari fed on more than blood, they fed on fear. Hope starved them. I think they sensed it when we spoke too freely, for the punishments grew harsher. One slave who dared to mutter escape aloud was dragged away. He returned the next day stitched together, his mouth sealed with hooks. Yet still, we whispered. Because silence meant acceptance, and acceptance meant death in all but name. I began to listen more closely. I memorized the shift patterns of guards, the hiss of gates, the faint drafts that hinted at unseen tunnels. I knew it was madness. But in Comora, madness was the only path that didn't end in chains. The day came when whispers turned into screams. My master, amused by some cruel whim, assigned me to the homunculi's domain. I had heard of them, artisans of torment, surgeons who treated flesh as both canvas and clay. The others called their lairs dungeons, but the word is too small for the truth. These were cathedrals of suffering. I was marched through corridors that smelled of burnt marrow and sweet, cloying incense. The walls were alive. I swear I saw faces pushing outward from the stone, mouths open in eternal howls. The air vibrated with the hum of machines that dripped blood instead of oil. The homunculus himself drifted into view like a shadow peeled from the wall. His body was stretched impossibly thin, his limbs jointed in too many places, his back crowned with mechanical arms tipped in saws and syringes. His mask was not to hide his features but to display them, warped and frozen in an expression of mirthless delight. He regarded me with eyes like bottomless wells and said, "Ah, fresh clay." The tasks he set were grotesque parodies of service. I carried vials that writhed with things still alive, swept floors stained with fluids that ate at my skin, and held down captives while his tools explored them. Each act stripped me further of my humanity. Yet I performed with precision, because hesitation brought punishment not from him, but from the tools themselves. Competence mattered even here. I learned how to brace a thrashing victim so they did not dislodge the scalpel. I learned which jars hissed dangerously if tilted. Another slave whispered that if you breathed shallow, the fumes would not send you into seizures. Knowledge became survival. Still, the horror pressed closer each day. I saw one of the pit fighters I had spoken with on the auction block, now a patchwork of limbs, her body remade into something that laughed and screamed at once. I realized then, escape was not simply a dream. It was the only way to avoid becoming art. Dreams are dangerous in Comora. They make you forget the chains on your wrists. I do not know what triggered it, perhaps the smell of scorched flesh, or the faint warmth of a lamp in the homunculi's halls. But that night, as I lay shackled in the slave pens, memory returned. I dreamt of my homeworld, a sky of pale blue, fields of wheat shimmering under twin moons, my sister's laughter carried on the wind, the taste of clean water, the warmth of sunlight. When I woke, My face was wet with tears. I had not cried since the day of capture. Others noticed. The thief who whispered maps to me in the dark leaned close. "What did you see?" she asked. When I told her, her expression twisted. Envy, despair, maybe both. "Hold on to it," she said finally. "Memories are armor. They can't take those." But they could. The next day, a guard caught another slave clutching a pendant, some trinket from his old life. The Drukhari tore it from him, mocked him for his attachment, then forced molten splinters into his palms so that when he grasped at the memory, all he held was pain. They laughed as he writhed. When my master saw me hesitate at a command, his gaze lingered. He knew. Somehow, he knew. That evening, he ordered me brought forward in front of his court. They stripped me bare and lashed me to a pillar of obsidian. Before the assembled crowd, he demanded I recount my dream. I stayed silent at first. Then came the lash, a barbed whip that tore skin with each strike. Finally, broken, I whispered the memory aloud. My sister's laugh. The wheat fields. The sunlight. The crowd howled in delight. My humiliation was their feast. The brand on my shoulder burned hot as fire. In that moment, I understood. Hope was a weapon, but not mine. It belonged to them, and they would twist it until it broke me. When the order came, it was spoken as though it were nothing at all, yet it changed everything. My master summoned us to the docking bay. The chamber was vast, filled with sleek raiding craft shaped like razors dipped in shadow. Chains rattled as we were herded aboard, shoved into narrow holds where we could barely breathe. The air was thick with the musk of fear. I thought we were bound for another dungeon, another arena. But then I heard the word, real space. We were going back into the galaxy of men. Through slits in the hull I glimpsed the transition. Webway gates cracked open like wounds in the void, spitting us out into real space with a shudder that rattled bone. For the first time since my capture, I saw stars unfiltered by Komarara's cursed glow. They were beautiful, distant, and utterly beyond my reach. The Drukhari prepared with terrifying efficiency. Warriors in barbed armor checked their splinter rifles, blades glistening with toxins. White stretched like dancers, their movements rehearsed to the rhythm of slaughter. Even the homunculized grotesque constructs stirred, syringes hissing. I realized with cold clarity, we were not passengers. We were part of the raid. Some were used as bait, chained to the prows, their screams amplifying the terror. Others were herded into holding pens, ready to be loosed into the path of defenders as distractions. I was fitted with a collar that sparked with every twitch, then bound to a group of others. When the raid began, it was like falling into a nightmare painted with fire. Sirens shrieked. The hull shook as the raider pierced through the atmosphere of some unsuspecting world. Through the viewing slit I saw settlements below, their lights flickering in peace that would not last another heartbeat. The Drukhari laughed as they descended. We wept. For the first time since my capture, I smelled fresh air, but it carried only the promise of blood. The city below was unprepared. I saw it in the way its defenses flickered too late, in the way civilians scattered like frightened vermin. We descended on them with a shriek of engines, the raiders cutting the sky apart. I was thrown forward as the craft slammed into a landing zone. The doors hissed open, and the Dark Eldar surged out with all the joy of predators unleashed. Splinter fire sang through the streets, each crystalline shard tearing through flesh. People didn't even have time to scream. They simply folded, collapsed, and bled. Others were taken alive, writhing in nets that hissed with paralytic toxins. We slaves were driven out behind them. My collar burned against my neck as the Drukhari dragged us forward, using us as human shields. Lasgun shots cracked in the distance as a desperate PDF force tried to hold the line. I saw one soldier hesitate, unwilling to fire into us, and in that moment a splinter shard went through his faceplate. His scream was short, but his death echoed in me. The cruelty was a performance. The Drukhari didn't just kill, they savored. Warriors carved symbols into walls with blooded knives. Wights danced among the terrified, slashing and withdrawing, prolonging agony for their own delight. A mother begged for mercy, clutching her child. They took the child, impaled it on a barbed spear, and left the woman alive to watch. I wished I could close my eyes, but the collar shocked me whenever I looked away. And then the homunculus arrived. His grotesque form glided across the street, his retinue of flesh beasts skittering on too many limbs. With a long finger, he chose among us slaves, marking some with alchemical ichor. Those marked were dragged screaming into his cages, destined for experiments worse than death. My number was almost called. Almost. In that moment, I realized that my suffering in Comora had only been rehearsal. The true horror of being a Dark Eldar slave was not the pain itself, but being used as an instrument of terror, to break others before they, too, were dragged into the abyss. The raid did not end quickly. That was never the Drukhari way. Hours stretched like years as we were driven deeper into the burning settlement. Flames consumed hablocks, choking the air with acrid smoke. Screams blended into one unbroken howl that seemed to come from the very stones. I stumbled over bodies, some cooling, others still twitching. Each step was forced by the burning surge of my collar. The Drukhari fed on despair. Warriors toyed with survivors, slicing tendons so they crawled, only to drag them by chains toward the raiders. Whites challenged militia fighters to single combat, their agility so unnatural it looked like dance. They fought not to win swiftly, but to perform, dodging bullets by a hair, letting blades scrape them just enough to draw crimson lines before they struck the killing blow. I could not fathom it. Pain was their music, suffering their art. We slaves were marched to a square where a towering statue of some imperial saint stood. The Drukhari desecrated it with gore, draping entrails across its arms like garlands. They laughed as they forced prisoners to kneel in mock prayer before it. When the statue's head was blasted off with a dark lance, the slaves who cried were executed. The ones who stayed silent were dragged away. Some of us broke. One man rushed to Drukhari, swinging a jagged piece of stone. He never made contact. The warrior caught him by the throat, lifted him high, and slit him open slowly while the rest of us watched. I learned then the most important rule: never give them entertainment unless it's what they demand. Resistance was not bravery. It was fuel for their joy. As night fell, the settlement's resistance collapsed. The defenders were butchered, their commanders taken alive for what I could only imagine would be endless torment. The raiders were loaded with captives, chained, gagged, paralyzed. We were among them, stuffed into cages so tight our ribs ground together. The smell of sweat, blood, and terror was suffocating. The city below still burned, casting light into the void. For a heartbeat, I thought perhaps the Imperium might respond, that a fleet or regiment might arrive. But the Drukhari were gone before any such hope could arrive. That was their cruelty. They struck, consumed, and vanished back into shadow before the galaxy even realized what had happened. As the raider lifted, I felt the strange pull of the webway open again. The stars vanished, swallowed by black. We were being dragged back to Comora, back into the nightmare I had once thought the worst fate imaginable. But after seeing real space aflame, I knew something darker. Comora was not hell. It was only the lair of its architects. The return to Comora was worse than the raid itself. When the gates of the webway sealed behind us, the screams did not fade, they multiplied. Hundreds of new captives howled, their voices joining ours in a chorus of despair that echoed off the jagged halls. The Drukhari reveled in it, dragging their prizes into the spires like hunters parading trophies. We were no longer just slaves. We were stock. The streets of Comora were alive with hunger. Cabals, cults, and covens jostled for spoils. Warriors sold captives like currency, trading men and women for weapons or poisons. Whites strutted through the crowds, marking chosen victims for the arenas. And above it all, homunculi drifted like carrion birds, their twisted silhouettes promising fates that defied sanity. I was herded with dozens into a holding pen of bone and steel. There, the sorting began. Slaves too weak to stand were killed outright, their bodies tossed to the racks for raw material. The strongest were branded for labor, their skins scorched with symbols of ownership. The most beautiful were taken aside, chained in velvet-draped cages, destined for pleasures I dared not name. I prayed to the Emperor, whispering words I had not spoken in years. Perhaps he would hear me, even here, in this place where light itself seemed banished. But no miracle came. Only the overseer's whip, lashing us into silence. That night, I saw what awaited those chosen for the arenas. They were marched past us, stripped bare, their bodies painted with luminous toxins that made their veins glow. Some begged for death before they even reached the gates. Their pleas were ignored. One turned to me as he was dragged by, a soldier, still with a fragment of defiance in his eyes. "Don't forget us," he said, voice raw. "If you live, remember." Then he was gone, swallowed by the howling crowds. The others whispered that the arenas were worse than death, that they were theatre for an audience that craved endless torment. I wondered if I might see him again, not as a man, but as entertainment. The thought hollowed me. Comora welcomed its new harvest. And I, one among thousands, realized my horror was only deepening. Survival meant not just enduring chains, but learning how not to be consumed by them. The city had swallowed me whole. Now, it would decide how I was digested. The first time I saw the arena, I understood why so many prayed for death. It was a vast amphitheater, a pit of jagged obsidian where the walls themselves seemed hungry. Tens of thousands of Drukhari filled the stands, their laughter like knives scraping bone. Lights blazed down, illuminating a floor slick with blood. The air throbbed with drums made from stretched skin, each beat rattling through my chest. We slaves were herded through tunnels beneath the arena, our collars burning as we stumbled forward. The smell of iron and sweat was suffocating. From above, the crowd howled for entertainment, a roar of anticipation that promised agony. I saw men collapse from terror before even stepping into the light. They were executed where they fell, their corpses dragged away for sport. When the gates opened, the chosen were shoved onto the sands. Some were given crude weapons, rusted blades, or bludgeons. Others were sent unarmed, their only role to die well. Against them strode the wights, sleek killers, their armor gleaming, their blades dancing with poisons. They moved with impossible grace, every step part of a cruel ballet. The fight was no contest. The wights toyed with their prey, dodging clumsy strikes, slicing tendons, letting blood spill in patterns like art. The crowd roared with each scream, demanding more, faster, bloodier. When a slave managed a lucky strike, the audience shrieked with glee, not for his bravery, but for the promise of his punishment. I was not chosen that day. I watched from the tunnel, forced to bear witness as men and women were cut apart for amusement. One WSH severed a man's hands, then forced him to fight on with his teeth, dragging it out until the crowd collapsed in ecstasy. Another carved a message into a prisoner's chest, a sigil glowing as his lifeblood ran out. When the last body fell, the crowd chanted for more. Always more. We were dragged back to our pens, trembling, silent. I knew my time would come. The wights did not kill all their slaves in one night. They savored, spreading the torment across endless spectacles. Survival was no mercy, it was only delay. That night, I dreamt of sand soaked black with blood, and an audience that demanded I dance for them until I broke. I awoke with one thought carved into my soul. In Comora, death was never the end. It was the entertainment. The day of my own choosing came without warning. The guards stormed into the pen, their barbed whips lashing. My collar flared white-hot as they dragged me to the gates. I struggled, not out of defiance but instinct, yet my resistance only earned laughter. I was nothing to them but flesh, another scream to add to their collection. The tunnel stank of blood and despair. Around me shuffled others chosen for the same fate. Some wept openly. Some muttered prayers to the emperor. One man, hollow-eyed, simply walked forward in silence, as if already dead. The gates opened, and the light struck me like a weapon. The crowd roared at the sight of fresh prey. I stumbled onto the sand, the air thick with smoke and the copper tang of blood. Weapons were tossed at our feet, a rusted blade, cracked shields, nothing more. The crowd jeered, mocking us before the killing had even begun. And then they came. The wights glided into the arena, their movements like serpents, their eyes shining with cruel joy. They bowed to the crowd, who screamed their names in ecstasy. The drumbeats quickened. My heart pounded with them. The fight was a nightmare painted in fire. A WICH lunged at me, her blade flashing. I barely raised my weapon, sparks leaping as steel met poison. She laughed, dancing back, toying with me. I struck again and again, each swing more desperate. She flowed around them all, her movements art, my own clumsy survival only fueling her delight. Around me, others fell. Screams rose, blood sprayed, and the sand grew slick beneath our feet. One man managed to wound his opponent. The crowd howled with glee as the WICH retaliated, severing him piece by piece until nothing remained. I should have died there. But for reasons I cannot fathom, my WICH spared me. She cut me shallowly, bleeding me but not finishing the kill. She circled, savoring my fear, tasting it. The crowd shrieked for more, but she bowed mockingly, leaving me alive, broken, bleeding in the sand. When I was dragged back to the pens, I realized the truth. Death was mercy. Survival meant being forced to return, again and again, until nothing remained but a hollow shell waiting for the next dance. And so I lived. Not because I was strong. Not because I was lucky. But because the whites had found me amusing enough to keep. That was the most horrifying truth of all. There are 10,000 ways to die in the 41st millennium, but few fates rival the torment of being a slave in Commorragh. To live beneath the lash of the Drukhari is not to live at all. It is to be consumed piece by piece, until your screams become part of their music, until your terror becomes a currency traded among monsters. For some, the horror ends quickly, a blade across the throat, a fall in the arena, an experiment gone wrong. But for many, survival is worse than death. To be spared by the whites means more suffering tomorrow. To be taken by the homunculi means eternity stretched across hooks and syringes. To be a slave in Commorragh is to wake each day in a place where mercy does not exist, where every heartbeat is a gift only because your captors are not yet finished with you. And yet, there is a truth even darker. The galaxy is vast, and the Drukhari are ceaseless in their raids. For everyone like me, there are countless more, torn from their homes, from their families, dragged screaming into the webway. Some will be broken swiftly. Others will endure for years, feeding the endless hunger of a city built on pain. So if you hear the shriek of raiders in the sky, if you see shadows fall across your world, pray. Pray that the Emperor's light finds you swiftly. For if the Dark Eldar take you alive, then your death will not be your end. It will only be your beginning. The Emperor protects. More stories await.